Hi, I'm Rebecca. When my sister Madison rolled her eyes at my fiancé Jake's uniform and sneered, "Seriously, Becca, a beat cop? You're really settling for someone who peaked in high school," she had no idea that in exactly 2 hours, she'd be watching the mayor of Denver present him with the Medal of Valor for leading the most successful hostage rescue in the city's history. But here's the thing about assumptions. They have a way of making people look incredibly foolish when the truth finally comes out. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The look on Madison's face when Jake walked into that ceremony in his tactical commander uniform with 4 stars on his shoulder and a room full of city officials standing to applaud him, absolutely priceless. But let me tell you how we got to that moment, because this story is about more than just my sister's ignorance. It's about what happens when someone judges your life based on their own shallow understanding of success. To really understand how spectacularly wrong Madison got everything, you need to know how Jake and I met and why my family had no idea who he really was. It all started 18 months ago on what should have been the worst day of my life, but turned into the beginning of everything good that followed. I was working as a pediatric nurse at Denver General Hospital, coming off a brutal 12-hour shift that had included 3 emergency surgeries and 2 families receiving devastating news about their children. It was one of those days that reminds you why healthcare workers have such high burnout rates. I was emotionally drained, physically exhausted, and questioning whether I had the strength to keep doing this job that I loved, but that demanded everything from me. I'd just changed out of my scrubs and was walking to my car in the hospital parking garage when I heard shouting echoing off the concrete walls. At first, I thought it might be someone having a medical emergency, so I turned toward the sound, my nursing instincts kicking in despite my exhaustion. What I saw instead was a man in casual clothes, jeans, a plain t-shirt, sneakers, trying to talk down another man who was clearly in some kind of psychological crisis. The second man was holding what looked like a weapon, though I couldn't tell exactly what from my distance, and he was screaming about losing custody of his kids, about the system being rigged against him, about how nobody understood what he was going through. The first man, the one in civilian clothes, was speaking in this incredibly calm, steady voice that somehow carried across the entire parking structure without sounding like he was shouting. "I hear you, Michael," the calm man was saying. "I understand that you're in pain. I understand that you feel like the world is working against you, but this isn't going to bring your kids back. This is going to take you away from them permanently." I should have called security or run back into the hospital, but something about the way the stranger was handling his situation kept me frozen in place. He wasn't trying to overpower the distressed man or trick him or manipulate him. He was just listening. Really listening, and somehow, incredibly, it was working. "You don't understand," the man with the weapon was crying now. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything." "You're right," the calm man replied. "I don't know exactly what you're going through, but I know what it's like to feel like you're out of options. I know what it's like to think that desperate actions are the only way to make people pay attention to your pain. And I know that there are other ways to fight for what matters to you." For 20 minutes, I watched this incredible display of patience and humanity as this stranger talked desperate father through the worst moment of his life. When the man finally put down his weapon and collapsed in tears, the first man didn't celebrate or call for backup or do any of the things you might expect. He just walked over and sat down on the concrete next to this broken person and kept talking to him quietly until hospital security and actual uniformed police officers arrived. That's when I learned that the hero in civilian clothes was actually Officer Jake Martinez, and he'd been off duty, just visiting a colleague who'd been injured in the line of duty when he'd heard the commotion and decided to intervene. The way he handled the situation was so different from every stereotype I'd ever had about police officers. No aggression, no authority complex, no need to dominate or control, just genuine human compassion combined with professional expertise. After the crisis was resolved and the man was taken to get the mental health support he needed, Jake noticed me standing there. I probably looked as shaken as I felt because his first words to me weren't about what had just happened, but about whether I was okay. That was pretty intense to witness, he said, walking over with that same calm energy he'd used during the crisis. Are you all right? Do you need to sit down for a minute? I told him I was fine, just impressed by how you handled everything. That's when he smiled for the first time since I'd been watching him, and it completely transformed his face. Up until that moment, he'd been this serious, focused professional, but when he smiled, I could see the warmth and humor that lived underneath all that competence. Most situations like that, people just want to be heard, he said simply. Once they know someone's really listening, really seeing them as a person instead of a problem to be solved, they usually want to find a way out that doesn't hurt anybody. We ended up talking for another hour in that parking garage. Not about the crisis that had just ended, but about our jobs, our families, our completely different perspectives on what it meant to serve other people. Jake told me he'd been in law enforcement for 8 years, but he talked about it like it was a calling rather than just a career. He mentioned specialized training, advanced certifications, leadership responsibilities, but never in a way that sounded like bragging. Just facts, delivered with the same matter-of-fact calm he'd used to diffuse a dangerous situation. When he asked for my number, I said yes without hesitation. Not because he was handsome, though he definitely was, but because I just witnessed him demonstrate the kind of character that you can't fake. The kind of person who steps into danger to help strangers, who treats everyone with dignity even in their worst moments, who has the skills to handle crisis situations, but chooses compassion over force whenever possible. Our first official date was 3 days later, and it was perfect in all the ways that mattered. Jake picked me up in a clean but modest pickup truck, took me to a family-owned Mexican restaurant where the staff clearly knew and respected him, and spent the entire evening asking thoughtful questions about my work and really listening to my answers. He was genuinely interested in what it was like to care for sick children, what drew me to pediatric nursing, what the most rewarding and challenging aspects of my job were. When I asked about his work, he was more reserved. He mentioned being assigned to specialized units, working cases that required additional training and security clearances, but he didn't elaborate much. At the time, I assumed he was just being modest or maybe following some kind of professional protocol about not discussing details of police work. I mostly deal with high-risk situations, he said when I pressed for more information. Crisis intervention, tactical response, coordinating with other agencies. It's rewarding work, but it can be pretty intense. I respected his privacy and didn't push for details. What mattered to me was how he treated people, how he carried himself, how he made me feel when we were together. Jake was steady, reliable, thoughtful, and completely present when we were together. After years of dating men who were either too self-absorbed to ask about my day or too intimidated by my career to take me seriously, being with someone who valued my intelligence and supported my ambitions felt revolutionary. Over the following months, we fell into an easy rhythm. Jake would pick me up after my shifts when he could, bringing coffee and listening to me decompress from difficult days. I'd text him encouragement before he went to work, knowing that his job involved dangers I couldn't fully understand, but trusting that his training and judgment would keep him safe. He met my friends and colleagues, and everyone loved him immediately. Not because he tried to impress anyone or because he had stories to tell about his work, but because he was genuinely interested in other people and had this rare ability to make everyone feel heard and valued. My friend Sarah, who worked in the emergency department, mentioned that some of the other hospital staff had asked about Rebecca's cop boyfriend and how impressed they were with his professionalism during the few times he'd been at the hospital for work-related matters. But here's what I didn't realize at the time. Jake was being deliberately vague about the specifics of his job, not because he was hiding anything from me, but because he'd learned that people often reacted strangely when they learned exactly what he did for a living. Some people became overly impressed and treated him differently. Others became nervous or uncomfortable. He'd found that it was easier to let people get to know him as a person before they learned about his professional accomplishments. So when I eventually introduced him to my family, all they knew was that I was dating a police officer named Jake Martinez who seemed to make me happy. And for my sister Madison, who measured everyone's worth by their income, their social status, and their potential to elevate her own reputation by association, that information was enough to form a completely wrong impression that would lead to months of condescending comments and passive-aggressive judgment. Madison had always been the sibling who cared about appearances. 5 years younger than me, she'd graduated from college with a business degree and immediately thrown herself into climbing the corporate ladder at a marketing firm. She made good money, drove a leased BMW, lived in a trendy downtown apartment, and dated men who looked good on paper, even when they treated her poorly in reality. To Madison, success was measured by salary, job titles, and social media presentation. She'd never understood why I'd chosen nursing over something more prestigious, why I drove a practical Honda instead of something flashy, why I lived in a modest apartment near the hospital instead of somewhere more impressive. In her mind, I was constantly settling for less than I deserved, and my relationship with Jake was just the latest example of my lack of ambition. The first time she met Jake at a family barbecue at our parents' house, I could see her cataloging everything about him that didn't meet her standards. His truck instead of a luxury car, his casual clothes instead of expensive brands, his job in public service instead of private sector success. She was polite enough during the introduction, but I caught the look she exchanged with our mom, the slight eye roll that said everything about what she thought of my choice in men.
Over the following months, Madison's comments became more frequent and less subtle. "Is Jake still doing the police thing?" she'd ask during our phone calls, like law enforcement was a phase he'd eventually grow out of. "Have you two talked about his long-term career plans? I mean, you're both getting to the age where you need to think seriously about financial stability." When Jake and I got engaged 6 months ago, Madison's reaction was a masterclass in passive-aggressive disapproval disguised as sisterly concern. "I'm so happy you're happy," she said, hugging me at the family dinner where we'd announced our engagement. "I just want to make sure you've really thought about what you want your future to look like." She started sending me articles about two-income households, about the importance of financial planning, about women who'd married down and regretted it later. She'd make comments about how hard it must be to plan a wedding on a public servant's budget and suggest that maybe Jake should consider transitioning to private security or corporate consulting, where he could really use his skills. The worst part was that she genuinely seemed to think she was helping. In Madison's worldview, she was the successful sister trying to save me from a life of mediocrity with a man who couldn't provide the lifestyle I deserved. She had no idea that Jake had been deliberately modest about his achievements, that his police work involved leading some of the most complex and dangerous operations in the city, and that his salary and benefits package was actually quite competitive with her corporate job. But I was about to learn just how wrong she was about everything, because the weekend that would change her entire perspective was only days away. The weekend when Denver would honor its finest first responders, and my quiet, humble fiancé would finally be recognized publicly for the hero he'd always been privately. The weekend when Madison would discover that sometimes the people you look down on are actually the ones looking out for everyone else. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first time Madison truly crossed the line happened 3 months before our engagement, at what was supposed to be a celebration dinner for my promotion to charge nurse in the pediatric ICU. I'd worked years for this position, and it represented not just a salary increase, but recognition of my clinical expertise and leadership abilities. Jake had been so proud when I told him about the promotion, he'd immediately suggested we take my family out to dinner to celebrate. We met at Palazzo Ristorante, an upscale Italian place downtown that Jake had chosen specifically because he knew Madison would appreciate the elegant atmosphere. He'd made reservations, arranged for flowers to be delivered to our table, and even coordinated with the restaurant to prepare a special dessert to commemorate the occasion. Everything was perfect, until Madison decided to make it about Jake's perceived shortcomings instead of my achievement. "This is such a nice restaurant," Madison said as we were seated, her tone carrying just enough surprise to be insulting. "Jake, this must be stretching the budget a bit. I hope you didn't feel pressured to go somewhere expensive just because it's a special occasion." Jake handled it with his usual grace. "Rebecca deserves to be celebrated properly," he said simply. "This promotion is a big deal, and I wanted tonight to reflect how proud we all are of her." But Madison wasn't finished. As we looked at the menu, she started making comments about the prices, suggesting we could share appetizers to keep costs reasonable, and asking Jake if he was sure about the wine list, since some bottles cost more than his daily salary. Each comment was delivered with a smile and framed as helpfulness, but the message was clear. She didn't think Jake could afford to treat her fiancé properly. The worst moment came when our server, a young man named Tony, who was clearly working hard to provide excellent service, was taking our orders. Madison ordered the most expensive entree on the menu, then immediately turned to Jake with fake concern. "Are you getting the chicken parmesan? That's a good choice. It's one of the more reasonably priced options. Very practical." She said practical like it was a disease. I watched Jake's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "Actually, I was thinking about the ossobuco. Rebecca mentioned she'd never tried it, and Tony recommended it as their signature dish." The ossobuco was $45. Madison's eyes widened with what looked like genuine alarm. "Oh, well, if you're sure you want to splurge. I just think it's important for couples to be realistic about their entertainment budget." That's when our dad, who'd been quietly observing this entire exchange, finally spoke up. "Madison, I think Jake can handle his own financial decisions. Maybe we should focus on celebrating your sister's accomplishment." But the damage was done. For the rest of the dinner, Madison kept making little comments about being smart with money and planning for the future that were clearly directed at Jake. She talked about her own salary, her investment portfolio, her plans to buy a condo in the trendy part of downtown. Every topic seemed designed to highlight the gap between her corporate success and Jake's public service career. When the check came, Jake didn't hesitate to hand over his credit card, but I saw Madison exchange a look with our mom that said everything about what she thought of the situation. After dinner, as we were saying goodbye in the parking lot, Madison pulled me aside for one of her sisterly advice conversations.
"Becca, I just want to make sure you're thinking clearly about your future," she said, glancing over at Jake, who was talking with Dad near his truck. "I mean, tonight was lovely, but you can't build a life on romantic gestures. Jake seems like a sweet guy, but you need to be realistic about what kind of lifestyle he can provide." I felt my temper starting to rise, but I kept my voice calm. "Jake and I are perfectly happy with our life together, Madison. Not everyone measures success the same way you do." "I'm not trying to be mean," she continued, "but you're 32 years old. You need to think about buying a house, starting a family, building real financial security. Can Jake really provide that on a police officer's salary? Have you seen his pay stubs? Do you know what his retirement benefits look like?" The questions felt invasive and insulting, not just to Jake, but to me, as if I was some naive woman who hadn't considered the practical aspects of building a life with someone, as if my own career and financial stability didn't factor into the equation at all. "Madison, Jake and I have discussed our finances extensively. We're both adults with good careers and solid financial planning. I don't need to justify our relationship to you or anyone else." But Madison wasn't deterred. Over the following weeks, her comments became more frequent and more pointed. She started sending me articles about financial planning for couples, about the importance of marrying up, about women who'd made practical choices in their relationships and been happier for it. She'd make comments during family phone calls about how she was dating someone in finance now and how it was so nice to be with someone who is ambitious. She'd ask pointed questions about our wedding budget, our honeymoon plans, our timeline for buying a house, always with the implication that Jake's career couldn't support the lifestyle I deserved.
The pattern escalated when Madison started dating Trevor Harrison, a financial advisor who drove a Mercedes and wore expensive suits and talked constantly about his investment strategies and networking opportunities. Suddenly, every family gathering became an opportunity for Madison to showcase her successful relationship while subtly undermining mine. At our cousin's wedding 2 months ago, Madison spent the entire reception making comparisons between Trevor and Jake. "Trevor just closed a deal that will net him a 6-figure commission," she announced during cocktail hour, loud enough for Jake to overhear. "It's so exciting to be with someone who's really going places professionally." When Jake went to get us drinks from the bar, Madison cornered me near the gift table with her most serious sisterly concern expression. "Becca, I love you, and I want you to be happy, but I'm worried you're settling. Look around this room. Do you see any other successful women married to men in service jobs?" I pointed out that several of my nursing colleagues were married to teachers, firefighters, social workers, and other professionals who chose careers in public service. Those are all honorable careers, Madison. Not everyone needs to work in finance to have value. "But you could have anyone," she pressed. "You're beautiful. You're smart. You have a great career. Don't you want to be with someone who matches your level of achievement? Someone who can open doors for you instead of someone you have to support?" That comment crossed a line I hadn't even known existed. The implication that Jake was somehow a burden, that our relationship was one-sided, that I was supporting him rather than building a partnership with an equal, it was so fundamentally wrong and so insulting to both of us that I actually felt physically sick. "Madison, you don't know what you're talking about. Jake is one of the most accomplished, intelligent, capable people I've ever met. The fact that you can't see that says more about your values than it does about his worth." But Madison had apparently decided that directness was the only way to get through to me. "Becca, he's a beat cop. I'm not trying to be cruel, but that's what he is. He walks around in a uniform, giving people traffic tickets and responding to domestic disputes. There's nothing wrong with that work, but let's be honest about what it is. You're an advanced practice nurse with a master's degree. You save children's lives. Don't you see the difference?" I saw the difference, all right. I saw that Madison had no idea what Jake actually did for work, no understanding of the training, expertise, and leadership required for his real position, and absolutely no interest in learning the truth because it didn't fit her narrative about successful relationships. But the worst part was how her constant criticism was starting to affect other people's perceptions. I noticed that our mom had started making similar comments about being practical and thinking about the future. Our dad remained supportive, but even he seemed to have absorbed some of Madison's doubts about whether Jake was ambitious enough for me. At family gatherings, I started noticing how Madison would steer conversations toward career talk when Jake was present, asking him questions about his beat and whether he'd ever considered advancing to detective work or moving into management. Each question revealed how little she understood about law enforcement hierarchy and specialization, but Jake never corrected her misconceptions. He'd just answer politely and change the subject. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago at our parents' anniversary party. Madison had brought Trevor, of course, and spent the entire afternoon making sure everyone knew about his latest professional victories. When someone asked Jake about his work, Madison actually interrupted his response. "Jake does community policing," she announced with the kind of patronizing smile you'd use to describe a child's finger painting. "It's really important work, keeping the neighborhood safe, very grassroots, very hands-on." Community policing. As if Jake spent his days helping elderly ladies cross the street and mediating neighbor disputes about barking dogs. I saw something flicker in Jake's eyes. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of weary resignation that told me this wasn't the first time someone had diminished his career based on assumptions.
Trevor, apparently feeling the need to be generous to the less successful man in the room, started giving Jake advice about transitioning into private security. "There's real money in corporate security consulting," he said, clearly pleased with his own magnanimity. "With your background, you could probably get certified and start building a client base. I could even make some introductions if you're interested." Jake thanked him politely, but I could see how much effort it took to maintain his composure. This man who dedicated his career to protecting people, who put his life on the line regularly, who'd earned recognition and advancement through years of exemplary service, was being offered career advice by someone who'd never risked anything more dangerous than a bad investment. That night, after we left the party, Jake was unusually quiet during the drive to my apartment. When I asked if he was okay, he just nodded and said he was tired. But I could see the weight of months of subtle disrespect and dismissal in the set of his shoulders, the way he gripped the steering wheel just a little too tightly. "Jake, I'm sorry about Madison and Trevor tonight. They don't understand what you do, and they're being unfair." He was quiet for a long moment. "It's not their fault," he finally said. "People make assumptions based on what they can see. I chose not to correct those assumptions, so I can't really complain when people draw the wrong conclusions." But I could see that it was wearing on him, this constant, subtle disrespect from people who should have been welcoming him into our family. And I was starting to realize that Jake had been protecting all of us from something, some larger truth about his career that would change everything about how people saw him. I had no idea that truth was about to be revealed in the most public, undeniable way possible, and that Madison's misconceptions were about to collide with reality in front of the entire city of Denver. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in early November. I was used to getting emergency calls from the hospital, but this wasn't my supervisor or a colleague asking me to cover a shift. It was Jake, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard before, a kind of controlled intensity that made my stomach drop before he even explained what was happening. "Rebecca, I need you to listen carefully. I'm going to be unreachable for the next several hours, possibly longer. There's a situation developing, and I'm being called in. I can't give you details, but I need you to know that I'm safe, and I'll contact you as soon as I can." I was immediately wide awake, my nursing training kicking in with that familiar surge of adrenaline that comes with emergency situations. "Jake, what kind of situation? Are you in danger?" "I can't discuss it over the phone," he said, and I could hear voices and radio chatter in the background. "But Rebecca, there might be news coverage. If you see anything about an incident in the warehouse district, don't panic. I'm trained for this, I have the best team in the state backing me up, and I'll come home to you." The line went dead before I could ask any more questions, leaving me sitting in my dark bedroom with my heart racing and my mind spinning through possibilities. Jake had never called me like this before. In all the months we'd been together, he'd never given me cause to worry about his safety beyond the general concern you have for anyone in law enforcement. His work had always seemed routine, professional, contained within normal business hours and predictable responsibilities. But the tone of his voice, the background sounds, the careful way he'd chosen his words, everything about that call suggested this was far beyond routine police work. I spent the next hour pacing my apartment, making coffee I didn't drink, and checking every news website and local television station I could find. Nothing. Whatever was happening, it hadn't hit the media yet. By 6 a.m., I couldn't stand the waiting anymore. I called into work and told my supervisor I had a family emergency, then drove to Jake's apartment. Not because I expected him to be there, he'd clearly said he'd be unreachable, but because I needed to feel closer to him somehow. I had a key, and I thought maybe being in his space would help me feel less helpless while I waited for news. Jake's apartment was exactly as he had left it, neat, organized, with the kind of precision that spoke to someone who needed to be ready to leave at a moment's notice. But as I sat on his couch, surrounded by his things, I started noticing details I'd somehow overlooked before. The police commendations on his bookshelf, partially hidden behind other items but clearly significant achievements. The stack of training manuals on his desk covering topics like crisis negotiation, tactical operations, and emergency response coordination. The kind of books that suggested someone's job involved far more complexity than writing traffic tickets and filing incident reports. There was a photo on his dresser I'd seen before, but never really examined. Jake in what looked like military-style tactical gear, standing with a group of other officers who all had the bearing and equipment of people trained for high-risk operations. They were posing in front of an armored vehicle, and everyone in the photo looked serious, professional, and definitely not like community police officers making routine patrol rounds.
As the morning progressed, I started getting calls from friends and colleagues who knew I was engaged to a police officer. Sarah from the ER called around 9 a.m., her voice tight with concern. "Rebecca, are you watching the news? There's something major happening downtown, and they're saying it involves specialized police units. Do you know if Jake is—" I turned on the television and felt my blood freeze. The local news was covering what they were calling a developing hostage situation in Denver's warehouse district. The camera showed a large industrial building surrounded by police vehicles, ambulances, and what looked like military equipment. Officers in tactical gear were positioned around the perimeter, and I could see sharpshooters on nearby rooftops. The reporter was explaining that an armed suspect had barricaded himself inside a packaging facility with an unknown number of hostages. Initial reports suggested the suspect was a former employee who'd been terminated several months earlier and had returned to the workplace with weapons and what might be explosive devices. The building housed over 200 employees, though many had been evacuated when the situation first developed around 4 a.m. My hands started shaking as the reality hit me. This wasn't routine police work. This was exactly the kind of dangerous, high-stakes situation that required specialized training, advanced equipment, and officers with experience in tactical operations. And Jake had been called in at 3:47 a.m., less than an hour after this situation had begun developing? The news coverage continued throughout the morning, with reporters providing updates every few minutes but very little concrete information. Police weren't releasing details about their tactical response, the number of hostages still inside, or the demands being made by the suspect. What they did keep emphasizing was that Denver's most elite crisis response team was handling the situation and that negotiations were ongoing. Elite crisis response team. The words echoed in my mind as I started to understand what I'd been missing all these months. Jake hadn't been vague about his job because he was ashamed of it or because it was routine work he didn't find interesting. He'd been vague because his actual responsibilities were sensitive, dangerous, and required security clearances that prevented casual discussion of operational details. By noon, I couldn't sit still anymore. I called Madison, not because I wanted to deal with her attitude about Jake, but because I needed someone from my family to know what was happening in case the worst occurred. "Rebecca, shouldn't you be at work?" Madison's voice carried her usual brisk efficiency, the tone of someone too busy with important things to chat with her sister during business hours. "Madison, Jake is involved in that hostage situation that's all over the news. I haven't heard from him in 8 hours and I'm scared." There was a pause. "What do you mean he's involved? Like he's helping with traffic control around the scene?" I felt a flash of frustration at her immediate assumption that Jake's role would be peripheral and unimportant. "No, Madison, he was called in at 4 a.m. as part of the tactical response team. He's inside that situation, dealing with armed suspects and hostages." Another pause, longer this time. "Rebecca, that doesn't make sense. Jake is a regular police officer. Those kinds of operations are handled by SWAT teams and federal agents, not beat cops." The certainty in her voice, the automatic dismissal of the possibility that Jake could be qualified for high-level operations, finally pushed me past my tolerance for her condescension. "Madison, you don't know what Jake does. You've never bothered to ask or listen. You've just assumed that because he doesn't brag about his job or try to impress people with his title, he must be doing something basic and unimportant."
Rebecca, I'm not trying to be mean, but you're clearly stressed and not thinking clearly. If Jake was some kind of elite tactical officer, don't you think that would have come up at some point? Don't you think our family would know? The question hung in the air, and I realized that Madison was right about one thing. It was strange that Jake had been so secretive about his real responsibilities, but her assumption that secrecy meant insignificance was completely wrong. Some jobs require confidentiality precisely because they're important and dangerous. Madison, I have to go. I'll call you when I know more. The afternoon dragged on with sporadic news updates, but no resolution to the crisis. The reporters kept mentioning that negotiations were continuing, that the tactical team was making progress, but no one was providing specifics about what was actually happening inside that building. By 4 p.m., I was sitting in Jake's apartment, staring at his bookshelf and trying to piece together clues I should have noticed months ago. Advanced crisis negotiation techniques, tactical leadership in high-risk environments, psychology of armed confrontation. These weren't books someone reads as a hobby, they were professional resources for someone whose job regularly involved exactly the kind of situation Jake was dealing with right now. I pulled out my laptop and started doing the kind of internet research I probably should have done when we first started dating, not because I had any reason to doubt Jake's honesty, but because I'd respected his privacy about work details and hadn't pushed for information he seemed reluctant to share. What I found made my head spin. Denver Police Department's Special Operations Unit, Elite Tactical Response Teams, Crisis Negotiation Specialists. Requirements for selection included years of exemplary service, advanced training certifications, psychological evaluations, and ongoing education in specialized areas of law enforcement. These weren't positions people stumbled into or got assigned by accident. They were careers that required dedication, skill, and the kind of professional excellence that Jake had never once mentioned to me or anyone in my family. At 6:30 p.m., my phone rang. Jake's number. I answered before the first ring finished.
Rebecca. His voice sounded exhausted but steady. It's over. Everyone's safe. I'm okay. I started crying before I could stop myself. Relief, fear, and overwhelming gratitude all hitting me at once. Jake, I was so scared. I've been watching the news all day and they wouldn't say what was happening and I kept thinking. I know, he said gently. I'm sorry you had to go through that. This kind of situation doesn't come up often, and I should have prepared you better for what it might mean when it does. Where are you now? When can I see you? I'm still downtown handling debrief and paperwork, but I should be done in a couple of hours. Rebecca, there's something we need to talk about when I get home. About my work, about why I haven't been completely open with you about what I do. After we hung up, I sat in Jake's apartment as the sun set over Denver, finally understanding that everything I thought I knew about my fiancé's career was just the surface layer of a much more complex and impressive reality. And I realized that Madison's ignorant comments over the past months hadn't just been annoying. They'd been completely wrong about someone who was quietly serving his community in ways she couldn't even imagine. The hero she'd dismissed as a loser cop had just spent 14 hours negotiating for the lives of innocent people, using skills and training that most people never develop and never need. And tomorrow, he'd probably go back to letting people assume he was just another officer writing parking tickets, because that's the kind of person he was, more concerned with doing the work than getting credit for it. But I had a feeling that era of secrecy was about to end, because the city of Denver was about to recognize Jake Martinez in a very public way. And Madison was about to learn exactly how wrong she'd been about everything. Jake arrived at his apartment at 9:15 p.m., looking like he'd aged 5 years in one day. He was still wearing his tactical uniform, not the regular police uniform I was used to seeing, but serious military-style gear that spoke to the gravity of what he'd just been through. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but there was something else in his expression that I'd never seen before. The weight of someone who just made life-and-death decisions for 14 straight hours. I met him at the door and wrapped him in the longest hug of our relationship,
feeling the solid reality of his bulletproof vest under my arms, and understanding for the first time just how literal the phrase life-threatening situation really was when it came to his job. "Are you hurt?" I asked, pulling back to look at him properly. The news didn't give any details about injuries or... "I'm fine," Jake said, but his voice carried a heaviness that suggested fine was relative. "Everyone made it out alive. That's what matters." He sat down heavily on his couch, and I noticed him unconsciously checking his phone, his radio, his equipment, the automatic movements of someone whose brain was still in crisis mode, even though the immediate danger had passed. "Jake," I said carefully, settling beside him, "I think we need to talk about some things I should have understood a long time ago." He looked at me with those steady brown eyes that had first caught my attention in the hospital parking garage, and I saw him making a decision that would change everything about our relationship going forward. "You're right, Rebecca," he said. "I should have been honest with you from the beginning, not because I was trying to hide anything from you specifically, but because I've gotten used to letting people make assumptions rather than explaining what I actually do." What Jake told me over the next hour completely reframed everything I thought I knew about his career, his qualifications, and the reasons behind his modest approach to discussing his work. Jake Martinez wasn't just a police officer. He was a lieutenant in the Denver Police Department's Special Operations Division, which meant that he was one of approximately 30 officers in the entire city qualified for the most dangerous and complex law enforcement operations. He'd been selected for the unit 4 years ago after 8 years of exemplary service that had included commendations for bravery, leadership awards, and advanced certifications in crisis negotiation, tactical operations, and emergency response coordination. The hostage situation I'd watched unfold on television hadn't been Jake assisting with crowd control or providing backup support. He was the lead negotiator, the person responsible for maintaining communication with an armed suspect while coordinating tactical response options and making strategic decisions about how to resolve the crisis with minimal casualties. "The reason I don't talk about it much," Jake explained, "is that most people react in ways that make relationships more complicated. Either they become overly impressed and start treating me differently, like I'm some kind of action movie character, or they become nervous and uncomfortable because they start imagining worst-case scenarios every time I go to work." I understood immediately why he'd chosen discretion over detailed explanations. Both reactions would change the dynamic of a relationship in ways that had nothing to do with who he actually was as a person. "But there's another reason I've been vague about the specifics," Jake continued, and his expression became more serious. "A lot of what I do involves sensitive information, ongoing investigations, and operational security that I can't discuss casually. It's not that I don't trust you, Rebecca. It's that my job requires a level of confidentiality that makes it easier to just let people think I do routine police work." As he spoke, I started understanding so many things that had puzzled me over the months we'd been together. The irregular schedule that sometimes required him to be unreachable for hours at a time. The way he deflected questions about specific cases or recent work experiences. His automatic awareness of exits and security vulnerabilities wherever we went. The deference other officers showed him when we encountered them in public settings. All of it made sense now that I understood Jake wasn't just another officer. He was someone whose expertise and judgment other people depended on during the city's most critical situations. "Jake," I said, trying to process everything he'd told me, "why didn't you feel like you could trust me with this information? We're planning to get married. I thought we were building a life together based on honesty and partnership." He took my hands in his, and I could see the exhaustion and vulnerability in his expression. "Rebecca, it wasn't about not trusting you. It was about not wanting my job to become the most important thing about me in your eyes. I've seen relationships fall apart because people can't separate the person from the profession. I wanted you to fall in love with Jake the man, not Lieutenant Martinez, the tactical officer. I realized that what I'd interpreted as secrecy had actually been Jake's way of protecting our relationship from the kind of complications that might have changed how I saw him or how we related to each other. But there's something else, Jake continued, and his tone became more cautious. Rebecca, your family, especially Madison, has made it pretty clear what they think about my career prospects and my ability to provide for you. If I'd corrected their assumptions, it would have looked like I was trying to impress them or prove something about my worth as a partner. This hit me like a physical blow. Jake had been enduring months of condescending comments and dismissive treatment from my sister, not because he couldn't defend himself or correct her misconceptions, but because doing so would have seemed like bragging or overcompensating. Jake, Madison doesn't understand what she's talking about. She's been completely wrong about everything, and she's been insulting you based on ignorance. I know, he said simply, but I also know that relationships work better when people get to know each other naturally, without the complications that come with titles and professional recognition. Your sister will form her own opinions about me eventually, based on how I treat you and how I show up as a person. The generosity of that perspective, allowing Madison to maintain her wrong assumptions rather than correcting her in ways that might embarrass her, spoke to exactly the kind of character that had made me fall in love with Jake in the first place. But there I also realized that his discretion had put me in an impossible position. For months, I'd been defending our relationship against Madison's criticisms without understanding that she was fundamentally wrong about the basic facts of Jake's career and qualifications. There's something you should know, I said carefully. Tomorrow evening is the annual Mayor's Public Safety Recognition Ceremony. The department submitted my name for the Medal of Valor based on today's operation and several other incidents from this year. My heart stopped. The Medal of Valor? Jake, that's the highest honor the city gives to first responders. It's recognition for doing the job, Jake said with characteristic humility. But, Rebecca, the ceremony is going to be public. There will be media coverage, city officials, recognition of my actual rank and position. If your family attends, they're going to learn everything I haven't told them directly. I felt a mix of pride, vindication, and anticipation that made my pulse quicken. Madison was about to discover that the loser cop she'd been dismissing for months was actually one of Denver's most elite law enforcement officers, someone whose professional achievements far exceeded anything she'd accomplished in her corporate marketing career. I want them there, I said immediately. Jake, my family needs to understand who you really are and what you've accomplished. Not because you need their validation, but because they've been treating you unfairly based on completely wrong assumptions. Jake was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through the implications of having this conversation become public knowledge. Are you sure? Once people know, everything changes. The way they see me, the way they talk about my work, the kind of attention that comes with public recognition, there's no going back to anonymity after something like this. I looked at this man who had spent his career protecting people while refusing to take credit for it, who'd endured months of disrespect from my family rather than defend himself in ways that might seem boastful, who just spent 14 hours negotiating for the lives of strangers and was more concerned about how the recognition might affect our relationship than about celebrating his own heroism. Jake, I have never been more sure of anything. I want the whole world to know exactly who I'm marrying. The next morning, I made a phone call that I'd been looking forward to for months without even realizing it. Madison, it's Rebecca. I need to talk to you about Jake's work. Oh, Rebecca, not this again. I thought we'd agreed that... Madison, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Everything you think you know about Jake's career is wrong. Completely. Fundamentally wrong. And tomorrow evening, you're going to find out just how wrong you've been.
I told her about the Medal of Valor ceremony, about his real position and qualifications, about the hostage situation and his role as lead negotiator. With each piece of information, Madison became quieter, and I could practically hear her worldview shifting over the phone.
"Rebecca," she said finally, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years, "are you telling me that Jake is some kind of elite tactical officer? I'm telling you that the man you've been dismissing as a loser cop is Lieutenant Jake Martinez, and tomorrow night, the mayor of Denver is going to present him with the city's highest honor for heroism in the line of duty." The silence that followed was the most satisfying pause of my entire life. "Madison, the ceremony starts at 7 p.m. at the convention center. I'm inviting the whole family because I want everyone to see exactly what kind of man I'm marrying. And I want them to understand that sometimes the people they underestimate are actually the ones protecting everyone else." After I hung up, I sat in my apartment and realized that tomorrow evening wasn't just about Jake receiving recognition he richly deserved. It was about Madison and everyone else who'd made assumptions about worth based on appearances, learning that their judgment had been spectacularly, embarrassingly wrong. And I couldn't wait to see the look on her face when she realized it. The 24 hours between my phone call with Madison and the Medal of Valor ceremony were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It felt like waiting for a storm that you know is going to change the landscape permanently, except in this case, I was looking forward to the destruction it would cause to Madison's smug assumptions about Jake's worth. But first, I had to navigate the awkward aftermath of Madison's sudden realization that she'd been spectacularly wrong about everything. She called me back 3 times that same day, each conversation revealing a different stage of her processing what I'd told her. The first call came an hour after our initial conversation, and her tone had shifted from shock to what sounded like defensive skepticism. "Rebecca, I've been thinking about what you said, and I'm having trouble understanding how this could be true. I mean, if Jake is really this high-ranking tactical officer, why has he been so secretive about it? Why wouldn't he have corrected us when we made assumptions about his career?" I could hear the careful way she avoided saying when we insulted and dismissed him for months, but I appreciated that she was at least beginning to recognize that assumptions had been made. "Madison, some people don't need to announce their accomplishments to feel validated. Jake's confidence comes from doing the work, not from making sure everyone knows how impressive his job title is." "But Rebecca, that doesn't make sense from a relationship perspective. If I were dating someone with that kind of career, I'd want people to know. I'd be proud of what he did. It would reflect well on me." And there it was, the fundamental difference between how Madison and I approached relationships. To her, a partner's achievements were valuable primarily for how they enhanced her own social status. To me, Jake's character mattered more than his professional recognition, though I was certainly proud of what he had accomplished. The second call came that evening, and Madison's tone had shifted again, this time toward what sounded like genuine anxiety. "Rebecca, I need to ask you something, and please be honest. How angry is Jake about the things I've said, about the way I've talked about his career?" This was the first time Madison had acknowledged that her behavior might have been hurtful rather than just misinformed. I could hear real worry in her voice, and I realized she was beginning to understand that she'd been insulting someone who'd been choosing not to defend himself rather than someone who couldn't. "Madison, Jake doesn't hold grudges. He understands that people make judgments based on limited information. But you should know that he's been incredibly gracious about comments that would have made a lot of people very angry." "Oh God, Madison, what do I do? How do I face him at this ceremony knowing what I've said? How do I apologize for months of being completely wrong?" It was strange hearing my usually confident sister sound so uncertain and embarrassed. Part of me felt satisfied that she was finally experiencing consequences for her condescending attitude, but another part of me felt genuinely sorry for her because I could hear how mortified she was by the realization of how badly she'd misjudged the situation. "Madison, just be yourself. Be genuine. Jake isn't interested in making you feel worse about this. He's not that kind of person. The third call came the next morning, just a few hours before the ceremony, and Madison sounded like she'd spent the night researching everything she could find about Jake's unit and the Medal of Valor award. Rebecca, I looked up the Special Operations Division online. Do you realize that Jake is probably one of the most elite law enforcement officers in the state? The selection process for that unit is incredibly competitive. They only accept people with perfect service records and advanced training certifications. I smiled, hearing Madison's voice take on the tone of someone who had discovered something genuinely impressive and was trying to process her own previous blindness to it. I also looked up the Medal of Valor recipients from previous years. These are people who have saved lives, prevented disasters, showed extraordinary courage in life-threatening situations. Rebecca, the man I've been calling a beat cop is about to receive the same award they gave to the officer who stopped that bank robbery downtown last year and the firefighter who rescued those kids from the apartment fire. I know, Madison. I've known Jake was special from the day I met him. I just didn't know the specific details of how special.
How are you not furious with me? Madison asked, and her voice cracked slightly. I've been so dismissive, so condescending. I've been treating him like he was holding you back from something better when he's actually accomplished more than almost anyone we know. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Not because I wanted Madison to suffer, but because I wanted her to understand that her way of measuring people's worth was fundamentally flawed. Madison, I'm not furious because Jake didn't want me to be. Every time you made one of your comments, he'd just tell me that people have different perspectives on success and that your opinions didn't change anything about our relationship. That makes it worse, Madison said miserably. He was being mature and understanding while I was being exactly the kind of person I'd hate to have as a sister-in-law. The ceremony was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the Denver Convention Center in the main ballroom that seated over 1,000 people. When Jake and I arrived at 6:30, I was amazed by the scale of the event. This wasn't a small departmental recognition dinner. This was a major civic celebration with city council members, the police chief, representatives from the fire department and emergency services, and what looked like half the law enforcement community in Colorado. Jake was wearing his dress uniform, and seeing him in the formal regalia of his actual rank was like meeting him for the first time all over again. The ribbons and commendations on his chest told a story of years of exemplary service that I was only beginning to understand. Other officers approached him with the kind of respectful deference that made it clear he was well regarded within the law enforcement community. Lieutenant Martinez, an older man with the bearing of senior command staff, said, as we made our way to our seats, "Outstanding work on the warehouse situation. That negotiation was textbook crisis resolution." "Thank you, Chief," Jake replied with his characteristic humility. "Good teamwork all around." I noticed that Jake introduced me simply as my fiancé, Rebecca, without mentioning my profession or trying to impress anyone with my credentials. Just like he'd always done with his own accomplishments, letting the relationship speak for itself rather than relying on external validation. My family arrived at 6:45, and I spotted them immediately across the ballroom. Dad looked proud and slightly overwhelmed by the formal nature of the event. Mom was clearly trying to take in all the details so she could describe everything to her friends later. And Madison? Madison looked like she was attending her own trial. She was dressed impeccably, as always, but her usual confident posture was replaced by something that looked almost like dread. Trevor was with her, and even he seemed subdued by the gravity of the occasion and what it meant about his previous dismissive comments regarding Jake's career prospects. When they reached our table, the introductions were unlike any previous family gathering we'd had. Dad shook Jake's hand with genuine respect, and I could see him taking in the uniform, the ribbons, the obvious significance of the evening.
Mom hugged Jake warmly and told him how proud she was to have him in the family, though her eyes kept drifting to his chest decorations, as if she was trying to decode what they all meant. But it was Madison's interaction with Jake that I'd been anticipating most. She approached him cautiously, and I could see her struggling with how to acknowledge the enormous gap between her previous assumptions and the reality of who he actually was. "Jake," she said carefully, "I owe you an apology. A very big apology. I've said things and made assumptions that were completely wrong, and I'm embarrassed by how I've behaved. Madison, I'm not furious because Jake didn't want me to be. Every time you made one of your comments, he'd just tell me that people have different perspectives on success and that your opinions didn't change anything about our relationship." "That makes it worse," Madison said miserably. "He was being mature and understanding, while I was being exactly the kind of person I'd hate to have as a sister-in-law." Trevor, clearly feeling the need to say something, but obviously struggling with how to address his previous dismissive offer to help Jake transition into private security consulting, settled on a simple, "Congratulations, Lieutenant. This is an incredible honor." As we took our seats and waited for the ceremony to begin, I looked around at my family and realized that everything had changed in the space of one conversation and one evening. The man Madison had dismissed as inadequate for me was about to be recognized by the city of Denver as one of its most valuable public servants. But more importantly, my family was finally seeing Jake the way I'd always seen him, as someone whose worth came from his character, his service, and his commitment to protecting others, not from his job title or his salary or his ability to impress people at dinner parties. The ceremony was about to begin, and I knew that by the end of the evening, everyone in that ballroom would understand exactly what kind of man I was lucky enough to marry. At exactly 7 p.m., Mayor Patricia Williams stepped up to the podium, and the ballroom fell into respectful silence. What happened over the next 90 minutes was the most vindicating experience of my entire life, but not for the reasons I had expected. Yes, watching Madison realize the magnitude of her misjudgment was satisfying, but what really moved me was seeing Jake finally receive the public recognition he deserved for years of selfless service. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mayor Williams began, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "we gather tonight to honor the men and women who embody the very best of public service. The individuals we recognize this evening have demonstrated courage, skill, and dedication that goes far beyond the call of duty." She went on to explain the significance of the Medal of Valor, emphasizing that it's only awarded to first responders who've shown extraordinary heroism in life-threatening situations. In the past decade, only 12 people had received this honor. Jake was about to become the 13th. The ceremony began with recognitions for several firefighters, paramedics, and police officers who distinguished themselves through various acts of courage and community service. Each story was compelling, and I found myself genuinely moved by the dedication these people showed to protecting and serving others. But I was also anxiously waiting for Jake's moment, wondering how they would describe his accomplishments to an audience that included my family and hundreds of other people who had no idea what he'd been quietly achieving throughout his career. When Police Chief Robert Anderson took the podium to present the law enforcement awards, I felt my heart rate accelerate. This was it, the moment when everyone would finally understand who Jake really was. "The final recognition of this evening," Chief Anderson announced, "is for an officer whose career exemplifies the highest standards of professional excellence, tactical expertise, and dedication to public safety. Over the past 4 years, Lieutenant Jake Martinez has served as a key leader in our Special Operations Division, handling some of the most complex and dangerous situations our city has faced." I glanced at Madison, who was sitting perfectly still, her attention completely focused on the chief's words. Her face showed a mixture of fascination and what looked like dawning comprehension of just how significantly she'd underestimated Jake. Lieutenant Martinez's service record includes successful resolution of over 40 high-risk incidents, including hostage situations, armed barricades, and crisis negotiations that have saved countless lives. His expertise in tactical operations and crisis intervention has made him one of the most respected officers in Colorado's law enforcement community. 40 high-risk incidents. I felt a chill as I realized how many dangerous situations Jake had navigated successfully while I'd known him. Situations he'd never mentioned because he didn't want me to worry or because operational security prevented him from discussing details. Chief Anderson continued, but it was Lieutenant Martinez's actions this week during a 14-hour hostage crisis that exemplify the extraordinary courage and skill we honor tonight. When an armed suspect barricaded himself in a warehouse facility with over 200 potential hostages, Lieutenant Martinez served as the lead negotiator, maintaining communication with an increasingly unstable individual while coordinating tactical response options with federal and local agencies. The room was completely silent now, with everyone hanging on every word of the chief's description. I could see people at nearby tables leaning forward, clearly impressed by the scope and complexity of what was being described. Through patient negotiation, tactical expertise, and exceptional decision-making under extreme pressure, Lieutenant Martinez successfully resolved the crisis with 0 casualties. Not only were all hostages safely evacuated, but the suspect surrendered peacefully and is now receiving the mental health support he desperately needed. 0 casualties. As someone who worked in healthcare, I understood exactly how remarkable that outcome was in a situation involving an armed, mentally unstable person and hundreds of potential victims. Lieutenant Martinez's actions during this incident, combined with his 4 years of exemplary service in our Special Operations Division, represent the very best of law enforcement professionalism. He has earned the respect of his colleagues, the gratitude of the community, and tonight, the city's highest honor for heroism in the line of duty. Chief Anderson paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in recognizing Lieutenant Jake Martinez, recipient of the Denver Medal of Valor. The applause was thunderous. Over 1,000 people stood simultaneously, creating a wall of sound that seemed to shake the building. I watched Jake make his way to the stage with his characteristic calm confidence, but I could see the emotion in his eyes as he took in the recognition from his peers and the community he'd served so quietly for years. As Jake accepted the medal from Mayor Williams, she leaned close to speak directly to him, though the microphone picked up her words for the entire audience to hear. Lieutenant Martinez, your service exemplifies everything we hope for in our public safety professionals. Your courage, your skill, and your dedication have made Denver safer for everyone who lives and works here. This community is fortunate to have you. Jake's response was exactly what I'd come to expect from him. Humble, gracious, and focused on teamwork rather than individual recognition. But what happened next made it impossible for him to downplay his individual achievements. The chief returned to the microphone for what was clearly an unscripted addition to the ceremony. Before Lieutenant Martinez returns to his seat, I want to share something with this audience that speaks to his character as both an officer and a person. My heart started pounding, wondering what else was about to be revealed. During the warehouse incident, Lieutenant Martinez was offered multiple opportunities to transfer tactical command to federal agencies with specialized hostage rescue teams. Protocol would have supported that decision, and it would have reduced his personal responsibility for the outcome.
Chief Anderson looked directly at Jake as he continued. Lieutenant Martinez declined those transfers not out of ego or territoriality, but because he'd established communication with the suspect and believed that maintaining that relationship was the best chance for a peaceful resolution. He chose to accept full responsibility for a situation that could have ended tragically because he believed his approach gave everyone the best chance of going home safely that night. The audience was completely silent, absorbing what this meant. Jake hadn't just done his job successfully, he'd made a conscious choice to take on additional risk and responsibility because he believed it was the right thing to do.
That decision required not just tactical expertise, but moral courage and the kind of judgment we hope to see from our senior leaders. Lieutenant Martinez embodies the values we strive for in law enforcement: service before self, community before personal advancement, and the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult. As Jake returned to our table, the standing ovation continued for what felt like forever. I watched him navigate through the crowd, stopping to shake hands with colleagues and accept congratulations from people who clearly knew and respected him within the law enforcement community. When he finally reached our table, my dad was the first to stand and embrace him. "Jake, I had no idea. I mean, I knew you were a good man, but I didn't understand the scope of what you do. Thank you for your service to our community." My mom was crying, happy tears, proud tears, the kind of emotional response she had when she encountered genuine heroism. "Jake, honey, I'm so proud to have you in our family. Rebecca is lucky to have found someone with your character and courage." But it was Madison's reaction that I had been anticipating most. She stood slowly, and I could see her struggling with how to acknowledge that everything she'd believed about Jake had been not just wrong, but spectacularly, embarrassingly wrong. "Jake," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you a complete acknowledgement that I've been blind, ignorant, and unfair. You're not just accomplished. You're a genuine hero, and I've been too focused on the wrong things to see it." She paused, clearly trying to find words adequate to the situation. "I judged you based on assumptions about salary and social status, while you were quietly saving lives and protecting our community. I'm ashamed of my behavior, and I'm grateful that you're generous enough to forgive it." Jake's response was pure grace. "Madison, thank you for saying that, but what matters most to me is that you love your sister and want the best for her. Everything else is just details." Even Trevor, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the ceremony, stepped forward to shake Jake's hand with genuine respect. "Lieutenant, I misjudged your career completely. What you do requires a level of skill and courage that I can't even imagine. Congratulations on this recognition. It's obviously well-deserved." As the evening concluded and we prepared to leave, I realized that the ceremony had accomplished something far more important than just proving Madison wrong about Jake's career. It had shown my entire family what I'd known from the beginning, that Jake's worth came from his character, his service, and his commitment to others, not from impressive job titles or social status. But there was still one more surprise waiting, one final moment that would make this evening perfect in ways I couldn't have anticipated. As we gathered our things to leave, Jake took my hand and asked if I'd walk with him to the front of the ballroom, where the Medal of Valor display had been set up for photographs. "I want to remember this moment with you," he said simply. "This honor means more because you're here to share it with me." Little did I know that Jake had one more way to make this evening unforgettable, and it had nothing to do with medals or public recognition. As we walked toward the Medal of Valor display at the front of the ballroom, I noticed that the crowd hadn't begun to disperse the way it usually does after formal ceremonies. Instead, people seemed to be lingering, talking in small groups, and I caught several glances in our direction that suggested something was happening that I wasn't aware of. Jake's demeanor had shifted too. The exhaustion from the previous day's crisis and the emotional weight of the evening's recognition had been replaced by something I couldn't quite identify. He seemed nervous, which was unusual for someone who'd spent 14 hours negotiating with an armed suspect without showing a trace of anxiety. "Jake," I said as we approached the display area, "are you okay? You seem different all of a sudden." He stopped walking and turned to face me, taking both my hands in his. The ballroom lighting caught the medal on his chest, and I was struck again by the contrast between the public recognition he was finally receiving and the quiet humility he'd shown throughout our entire relationship. "Rebecca," he said, and his voice carried a formality that made my heart skip. "This evening has been about honor and recognition, about the community acknowledging service and sacrifice, but there's something else I want to acknowledge tonight. Something that's more important to me than any medal or public ceremony.
Before I could ask what he meant, Jake did something that made me forget we were standing in a room with hundreds of people. He got down on one knee. The entire ballroom went silent. I heard someone behind me gasp. I think it was my mother, but my attention was completely focused on Jake as he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box.
"Rebecca," he said, looking up at me with those steady brown eyes that had first captured my attention in a hospital parking garage, "you fell in love with me when you thought I was just a regular police officer. You supported my career when your own family questioned whether I could provide for you properly. You defended our relationship when people made assumptions about my worth based on limited information." My hands were shaking, and I was vaguely aware that people were moving closer to witness what was happening, but Jake's words held my complete attention. "Tonight, everyone in this room knows about my professional accomplishments, my service record, my recognition from the city. But you've always known something more important. You've known the person I am when no one else is watching. You've known my character, my values, my heart." I could feel tears starting, the happy kind that come when something perfect is happening at exactly the right moment. "I don't want to marry you because you're impressed by my job or because your family now approves of my career prospects," Jake continued, his voice growing stronger and more confident. "I want to marry you because you chose to love me when you thought I was ordinary, and that means more to me than any recognition I could ever receive." He opened the ring box, revealing a beautiful solitaire diamond that caught the ballroom lights and seemed to sparkle with its own internal fire. "Rebecca Martinez," Jake said, using the name I'd take after our wedding. "Will you marry me? Not because I'm Lieutenant Martinez with a Medal of Valor, but because I'm the man who wants to spend the rest of his life earning your love every single day." The proposal was perfect in ways I couldn't have scripted or imagined. Jake had chosen to ask me to marry him at the moment when everyone finally understood his professional worth, but his words made it clear that our relationship had always been about something deeper than career success or public recognition. "Yes," I said, though the word came out as barely more than a whisper through my tears. "Yes, of course, yes." As Jake slipped the ring onto my finger, the ballroom erupted in applause that was somehow even more enthusiastic than what had followed his medal presentation. But this time, the celebration wasn't just about professional achievement. It was about love, commitment, and the kind of partnership that transcends job titles and social expectations. When Jake stood up and kissed me, I was dimly aware that we were being photographed by official ceremony photographers and probably dozens of people with cell phones, but I didn't care. This moment belonged to us, regardless of who was watching. As we broke apart, still surrounded by applause, I saw my family approaching with expressions that ranged from joy to amazement to what looked like profound relief on Madison's part. "Jake?" my dad said, shaking his hand vigorously. "Welcome to the family. Officially, I mean. You've been part of it in every way that matters for months." My mother was crying again, but these were definitely happy tears. "Oh, honey," she said, hugging both of us simultaneously. "This is perfect. Absolutely perfect. You two belong together." But it was Madison's reaction that surprised me most. Instead of her usual commentary about timing or practicality or wedding planning logistics, she just hugged me tightly and whispered, "Rebecca, I'm so happy for you, and I'm so sorry it took me this long to understand what you saw in him." Chief Anderson approached our group, clearly pleased that his medal presentation had been followed by such a personal celebration. "Chief Martinez, congratulations on your engagement. And Miss Rodriguez, you're getting a good man, one of the finest officers I've ever had the privilege to serve with." Over the next hour, as the ballroom gradually emptied, Jake and I found ourselves surrounded by his colleagues from the police department,
city officials who'd attended the ceremony, and friends who'd heard about the proposal through the social media posts that were already starting to appear online. Everyone wanted to congratulate us, to see the ring, to hear how long Jake had been planning the proposal. What struck me was how naturally Jake handled the attention, graciously accepting congratulations while consistently deflecting focus back to our relationship rather than his own achievements. Actually, Jake told one reporter who'd been covering the ceremony, the timing worked out perfectly, but I've been carrying that ring for 2 weeks. I was originally planning to propose this weekend during a quiet dinner at home. But after everything that happened with the warehouse situation, and knowing that tonight would finally show everyone who Rebecca really chose to marry, it felt like the right moment to make our commitment public. As we finally prepared to leave the convention center, I realized that this evening had exceeded every expectation I had about vindication and family dynamics. Madison hadn't just learned that she'd been wrong about Jake's career. She'd witnessed him choose to propose at the moment when his professional worth was most visible, while explicitly stating that professional recognition wasn't the foundation of our relationship. In his proposal, Jake had demonstrated the same character that had drawn me to him in the first place, the ability to achieve remarkable things while remaining fundamentally humble, the wisdom to understand that love transcends social status, and the confidence to be vulnerable in front of hundreds of people because he knew our relationship was built on something solid. Jake, was this really spontaneous, or have you been planning this for a while?
He smiled, the kind of private smile I'd come to associate with moments when he was about to reveal something that would surprise me. I've been carrying the ring for 2 weeks, like I told the reporter, but I made the final decision to propose tonight about 30 seconds before Chief Anderson called my name for the medal presentation. What made you decide? I was sitting there listening to him describe my service record, watching your family finally understand what I do for work, and I realized that none of it mattered as much as the fact that you'd chosen me before any of them knew about my accomplishments. That's when I knew I wanted to ask you to marry me at the moment when everyone else finally understood what you'd seen all along. As we drove through downtown Denver toward my apartment, I looked at the ring sparkling on my finger and realized that Jake's proposal had been the perfect ending to months of defending our relationship against people who couldn't see past their own narrow definitions of success. But more than that, it had been Jake's way of making a public statement about what really mattered in relationships. Not impressive job titles or social status or the approval of people who measure worth by salary and prestige, but genuine love, mutual respect, and the kind of partnership that can weather any external judgment. Rebecca, Jake said as we pulled up to my building, there's one more thing I want to tell you about tonight. What's that? When I was making the decision about whether to propose, I wasn't thinking about proving anything to your family, or about the dramatic timing, or about getting back at people who'd underestimated me. I was thinking about you, about how you've supported me, believed in me, and built a life with me based on who I really am rather than what I do for work. He paused, clearly searching for the right words to express something important. Tonight was about recognition and vindication and all those external things that feel good in the moment. But what matters to me is that we're building something together that doesn't depend on other people's approval or understanding. The medal is nice, but it's not what makes me proud. You're what makes me proud. As we sat in his truck outside my apartment building, both of us still wearing formal attire and processing everything that had happened in one extraordinary evening, I understood that we'd experienced something far more significant than just a satisfying reversal of Madison's misconceptions. We'd publicly committed to a partnership built on authentic love, rather than social expectations, and we'd done it surrounded by a community that finally understood what I'd known from the beginning, that sometimes the most remarkable people are the ones who don't need to announce how remarkable they are. The medal ceremony had been about Jake receiving recognition he deserved, but the proposal had been about us choosing each other again, publicly and permanently, for all the right reasons. And that was going to make for one hell of a wedding story.
6 months have passed since that extraordinary evening at the Denver Convention Center, and life has settled into a new rhythm that's both familiar and completely transformed. Jake and I are married now. We had our wedding 3 months ago in a ceremony that was everything we wanted it to be. Intimate, meaningful, and focused on the people who truly matter to us rather than impressing anyone with elaborate displays. But the real story isn't about the wedding, as beautiful as it was. The real story is about how relationships change when truth replaces assumptions, and how people grow when they're forced to confront their own prejudices and misconceptions. Madison and I have rebuilt our relationship on completely different foundations. The sister who once measured everyone's worth by their salary and social status has become someone who asks deeper questions about character, service, and what it really means to contribute to your community. It didn't happen overnight, and there were some difficult conversations along the way, but the transformation has been genuine and lasting. The first major shift came about a month after the medal ceremony when Madison called me with an unusual request. "Rebecca," she said, her voice carrying none of the confident authority I'd been used to hearing, "I've been thinking about what happened at Jake's ceremony, and I realize I need to understand something better. Would it be possible for me to visit Jake's workplace? I mean, if it's allowed and appropriate. I want to see what he actually does." The request surprised me, not because it was unreasonable, but because it represented such a departure from Madison's usual approach to learning about people. Instead of making assumptions based on limited information, she was actively seeking to understand something that had challenged her worldview. Jake arranged for Madison to visit the Special Operations Division during a training day, when she could observe exercises and meet some of his colleagues without interfering with actual operations. What she saw that day changed her perspective on public service in ways that went far beyond her understanding of Jake's career. She watched tactical training simulations that required split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. She met crisis negotiators who talked armed suspects into surrendering peacefully, saving countless lives in the process. She learned about the months of preparation that go into every high-risk operation, the constant training and certification requirements, the psychological evaluations that ensure officers can handle life-threatening situations responsibly. "Rebecca," Madison told me after that visit, "I had no idea. I literally had no conception of what elite law enforcement work actually involves. The level of skill, the training requirements, the responsibility these people carry. It's like discovering that someone you thought was a high school teacher is actually a brain surgeon." But what affected Madison most wasn't the impressive nature of Jake's work. It was meeting his colleagues and understanding the culture of service that defined their professional community. "These people don't do this work for recognition or money," she said. "They do it because they believe in protecting people who can't protect themselves. Jake isn't unusual in that environment. They're all like that. Dedicated, humble, focused on the mission rather than personal advancement." That conversation marked the beginning of Madison's broader reevaluation of how she'd been measuring success and worth in her own life. Over the following months, I watched her start asking different questions about the people she dated, the career choices she made, and the values she wanted to prioritize. The change became most obvious when she broke up with Trevor, not because there was anything dramatically wrong with him, but because she'd started to realize that their relationship was built primarily on mutual appreciation for each other's professional status, rather than deeper compatibility or shared values. "I kept waiting to feel about Trevor the way you obviously feel about Jake," Madison explained to me during one of our regular coffee meetings. "Not just proud of his accomplishments, but genuinely excited to spend time with him, genuinely interested in his thoughts and perspectives on things that matter." Madison started dating someone new about 2 months ago, a high school history teacher named David who volunteers with veteran support organizations and coaches youth baseball in his spare time. When she introduced him to the family, the difference in how she talked about him was striking. Instead of leading with his credentials or professional achievements, she talked about his character, his sense of humor, his commitment to his students and community. "David doesn't make as much money as Trevor did," Madison told our parents during that introduction, "but he's the kind of person who makes everyone around him better. He's passionate about what he does, he's generous with his time and attention, and he makes me want to be a more thoughtful person." Madison's shift in values has extended beyond her personal relationships to her professional life as well. She started taking on pro bono marketing work for nonprofit organizations, using her corporate skills to help community service groups reach broader audiences and secure funding for their programs. It's work that doesn't pay as well as her corporate clients, but she finds it more meaningful and rewarding. I used to think that work was valuable only if it generated impressive income or social status. Now I realize that some of the most important work in the world is done by people who chose service over salary. My parents have undergone their own transformation in how they think about success in relationships. Dad, who'd always been quietly supportive of my choices, became actively proud of Jake's service in ways that went beyond just accepting him as my husband. He started following local news coverage of police operations, learning about public safety challenges in Denver, and expressing genuine appreciation for the risks that first responders take on behalf of their communities. Mom, who'd been influenced by Madison's initial skepticism about Jake's career prospects, became one of his most enthusiastic supporters. She started volunteering with a police family support organization, helping to coordinate services for officers' families during crisis deployments. Her work there gave her insight into the sacrifices that law enforcement families make, and she developed deep respect for the community Jake serves. "I'm ashamed that I ever worried about whether Jake could provide for you properly," Mom told me during one of our conversations. "I should have been grateful that you found someone willing to risk his own safety to protect other people's families." The changes in my family dynamics have been gratifying, but the most important outcome of that evening 6 months ago has been the strengthening of my relationship with Jake. Not because external validation changed anything fundamental between us, but because the experience of weathering judgment and then being vindicated together deepened our partnership in lasting ways. Jake has become more open about his work, sharing appropriate details about his cases and helping me understand the complexities of modern law enforcement. I've gained appreciation not just for his professional expertise, but for the emotional resilience required to handle traumatic situations regularly while maintaining compassion and judgment. Our marriage is built on a foundation that was tested before we even had our wedding. We know that our relationship can survive external criticism, family skepticism, and social pressure because we've already been through all of that and emerged stronger. But perhaps the most meaningful change has been in how we talk about success and achievement within our own relationship. Jake's medal ceremony taught us both that public recognition, while gratifying, isn't what sustains a partnership through difficult times. What matters is daily respect, mutual support, and shared commitment to building something together that reflects both of our values. We've started doing volunteer work together. Jake helps with crisis intervention training for social workers and healthcare professionals, while I provide medical consultation for police family support services. It's work that combines our professional expertise with our shared commitment to serving our community, and it's brought us closer together in ways that purely recreational activities never could. 3 months ago, Jake was promoted to captain, which means increased responsibilities and leadership of multiple specialized units within the department. The promotion came with higher salary, better benefits, and significant recognition within the law enforcement community. But what makes me proudest isn't the advancement itself. It's the fact that Jake's promotion was based on his colleagues' respect for his judgment, his leadership abilities, and his commitment to training the next generation of tactical officers.
"I want to be the kind of leader who helps other people achieve their potential," Jake told me when he was offered the promotion, the same way Patricia Walsh and Chief Anderson invested in my development when I was starting out. Madison's response to Jake's promotion was telling. Instead of focusing on the salary increase or social status implications, she congratulated him on the opportunity to mentor other officers and contribute to public safety training programs. Her questions were about the impact of his new role rather than the personal benefits he'd receive. "Jake, this means you'll be training the next generation of crisis negotiators, right? That's incredible. You're literally multiplying your ability to save lives by teaching other people your skills." As I write this, I'm sitting in the home Jake and I bought together in a quiet neighborhood not far from downtown Denver. It's not the most expensive house we could have afforded, but it's perfect for us. Close enough to both our workplaces that we can support each other during difficult shifts, with enough space for the family we're hoping to start in the next few years. Looking back on the past year, I realized that the Medal of Valor ceremony wasn't just about Jake receiving recognition or Madison learning to appreciate his career. It was about all of us learning that true worth comes from character, service, and the courage to do what is right even when no one's watching. Madison learned that impressive job titles and high salaries don't necessarily indicate the kind of character you want in a life partner. My parents learned that public service careers can be every bit as challenging, rewarding, and valuable as private sector success. And Jake and I learned that a relationship built on authentic love and mutual respect can weather any external judgment or social pressure. The evening that began with Madison calling Jake a loser cop ended with our entire family understanding that he's actually one of the most accomplished, respected, and valuable people in our community. But more importantly, it ended with all of us recognizing that his professional achievements, impressive as they are never the reason he deserved our respect and love. Jake earned that through his daily choices, his treatment of others, his commitment to service, and his willingness to risk his own safety to protect people he's never met. Those qualities were visible from the beginning to anyone who was paying attention. It just took public recognition for some people to finally notice what had always been there. Sometimes the people you underestimate are the ones protecting everyone else. Sometimes the quiet heroes are doing the most important work. And sometimes the best thing that can happen to your family is being proven completely wrong about someone who turns out to be exactly the partner you never knew you needed. Madison learned that lesson the hard way, but she learned it thoroughly. And now she's building her own relationships on the same foundation of character and service that she finally recognized in Jake. As for me, I'm married to a man who saves lives for a living and comes home every evening grateful for the opportunity to serve his community. A man who received his city's highest honor for heroism and used the moment to propose to me, emphasizing that professional recognition meant less to him than building a life together based on authentic love. I'd say we all learned something valuable about what really matters in relationships and in life. And Madison never made another comment about anyone being a loser cop ever again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.